Did Moses exist? Did he write the Pentateuch? If these questions are a no, what does that say about the nationalistic history of Israel? To the people that are called Jews? Or what about Christians? What about Muslims, who all hold to the same figurehead as part of their origin story? Well, we're actually trying to tell you about a course coming up called Finding Moses. You could sign up at mythvisionpodcast.com/Moses. Go sign up now. It's in the description. I also have it as a pinned comment beneath this video. In this course, he's going to dive deep into various schools of thought within academia. And what does the consensus say about Moses and about the origins of this literature? Dr. Ehrman, welcome back. Simple question. Did Moses exist?
Right. Well, it depends whom you ask. I guess you're asking me. And I don't know. I don't know if there is some figure back there named Moses. What I'll be arguing in my course is that there are historical problems with virtually all of the stories found in Exodus through Deuteronomy. But there are interesting aspects of the stories that make one wonder. One of which is the name of Moses himself. The name Moses is not a Hebrew name. It's an Egyptian name. And it occurs in the other names we know from Egypt. And so it's an interesting point, because if an Israelite, if a Hebrew-speaking person made up these stories about the great leader of the children of Israel, why wouldn't they give him a Hebrew name? And so that's made some people think, well, there may be some kind of figure back there. That's what a lot of people think. Another option is the one that I kind of lean toward, which is that if you're a smart Israelite author, and these are smart people, they're elite, they're intelligent people, and you're making up a story that's connecting Israel with Egypt, it adds a bit of kind of plausibility if the guy who's brought up by Pharaoh's daughter is given a Egyptian name. And so that would be what scholars would call verisimilitude, where you make fiction sounds very much like history. And so I'm not quite sure if there's anything back there in terms of the person or not, but it's certainly possible.
By any chance, has your work been influenced by scholars like Joel Baden, Conrad Schmid, Ronald Hendel, or any of these academics, maybe Mark Lucher, Thomas Dozman, Thomas Romer, David Wright, Bob Cargill, forgive me if I'm butchering some of these names. Does any of your scholarship in the field of learning about Moses, the Exodus, the conquest, or the wilderness, journey of 40 years, have any influence from them?
Yes. They're all very fine scholars. I know a number of them. I've known some of them for years, and it's these are among the best, in my opinion, among the best historical scholars of the Hebrew Bible that are out there right now. These are people who've devoted their lives to these kinds of investigations, and they're serious historical scholars. Some of them do have faith commitments, and it's not that they're not like crazy atheists out there trying to study the Hebrew Bible. I don't know about all of them, but in fact, the ones that I do know actually have faith commitments, but they're rigorously historical, and have been, I think, helpful for unpacking a lot of things. A lot of these people are doing scholarship beyond what I myself learned when I was doing my graduate studies in the late 70s and early 80s. So when I was studying Hebrew Bible, things have changed a lot since then, and these are some of the leading people doing it.
And do you think the Moses story, especially Exodus, maybe wilderness wandering, I wonder if that's completely fictitious in my thinking, but do you think that a cultural memory approach is the best approach in terms of the Moses narrative?
It's a complicated question, in part because cultural memory doesn't always mean the same thing to every scholar. My view is that there are different ways to approach stories such as you find in Exodus and Numbers, especially where you get the narratives, but the legal materials too, the laws that Moses gives. I think that there are a variety of ways that you can approach stories like this. You can approach them from a literary point of view in order to understand how they work as a story, how they function literarily, because the meaning we get out of these stories usually is based on the narrative character of them, in part because we, as human beings, tend to think narratively. We tend to think about narratives. And so I think a literary approach is very important because they've come down to us as literature. I think straight up history, where you try to figure out what happened here, is really important too. I think cultural history, where you understand, I mean, again, different people mean different things by this, but it's, I guess, most people think of this as kind of a newer form of history, but the history of a people and understanding how people have developed their understanding of their own past, and constructing it as a way of making sense of people making sense of their own past, is also another important way to do it. I don't think these are mutually exclusive ways of approaching any of these texts. I think the best approach is to use the tools provided by a range of methodologies.
Thank you for that. In this course coming up, you're a big textual critic, and I love that about you with New Testament studies. And it doesn't take much, I'm sure, for you when you read these other academics who are pouring through Deuteronomy, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Do we see some obvious evidences there are different authors in different periods writing this material? Therefore, Moses couldn't have written this material.
Yeah, I would say that's a fair consensus among historical scholars. That in fact the Pentateuch is not one author writing at one time, let alone Moses. There were doubts about Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch way hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I mean, in the Middle Ages, there were rabbis who were pointing out passages that couldn't make sense if Moses wrote it. And so that's what ends up happening especially in the 19th century, is that scholars started digging in deep. And I would say today, the majority of scholars in America especially continue to think that there were various sources that were put together into what is now our Pentateuch. The traditional formulation of that is the JEDP theory, the documentary hypothesis, where you have four sources written by four authors at four different times that have been spliced together. And I'd say that today that theory has become made a lot more complicated by scholars who've dug further into it. But the basic idea behind it is one that virtually everybody subscribes to, which is that this is not the product of a single author. It's a number of sources that have been spliced together in one way or another. And one piece of evidence of that is precisely the kinds of contradictions that you find in this. You'll find in particular stories. You'll have a story, just the story of the plagues. You know, when you read the story of the plagues, you find these contradictions that don't make any sense. If somebody sat down and wrote this thing, he was either like not completely awake at the time, or he's taken sources and put them together, because they just contradict each other. And so there's plenty of evidence for multiple layers and multiple authors that I think probably everyone that you mentioned earlier would agree with.
Do you find any apparent contradictions that you can give an example of in the Moses narrative throughout these four books?
Yeah, lots of them. I'll be talking about them. I'll give you one now. So you get these 10 plagues against Egypt. And when I was a kid, this is my favorite part of the Bible, actually. I was a young kid. My mom knew there was something wrong with me because I liked all these plagues, with blood and the gnats and the frogs and things. So you get this one plague where the livestock, there's an epidemic. All the livestock of the Egyptians, every one of the livestock is killed. And then plague later, hail comes, and hail wipes out all of the fields of the Egyptians and the livestock in the field. You say, wait a second, the livestock just got killed. What livestock are these? And so it's pretty interesting to hear people try to explain this. Well, what happened was when when the livestock all died, the Egyptians went in and they stole all the Israelite livestock. So those were the ones in the field. Those are the ones that got killed next. And so so you kind of go from there.
There's a lot of funny things I'm sure we'll find out in your course, and I really look forward to that. As far as the Sargon narrative, we've heard, he's put in a basket. There's always this, almost you could call it a miraculous birth narrative, so to speak, where he overcomes this, some type of feat as an infant. And in the river, we see the same thing with Moses. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And does this help us see Moses more as a mythological figure? Or would you say, how would you want to approach Moses if we could find common tropes from other figures?
Yeah, well, you certainly do. And it's like, it's the same problem you get earlier in the Pentateuch with the book of Genesis, where, you have this flood narrative that wipes out the earth, and one man and his family are saved by building a big boat and putting all the animals in it. And then all of a sudden you discover that, there's an epic of Gilgamesh that's hundreds and hundreds of years old that has the same story. So what does that do? Well, it's the same thing with the Sargon thing. So you get a similar account of somebody who's going to be a great leader of the people, who is miraculously saved as an infant by being put in a reed basket and being discovered, and you get this discovery narrative and his salvation, and you think, wow, okay, that sure sounds familiar. And so I think what happens in all of these cases, and there are a lot of these cases that you can point out, not just with Sargon, of course, you're dealing with another ancient Near East story, just as you are. Gilgamesh is an ancient Near East story that relates to the flood. Sargon's infancy narrative is related to Moses, but you get them cross-culturally too, right? You get flood narratives in Greece, and you get you get the founders of Rome, Romulus and Remus, being miraculously saved as babies, and then you get these stories that are trying to do similar things. And so one of the big questions that historians of tradition have is, are these directly influencing each other? Like, does the author of Genesis know the Epic of Gilgamesh? Or does the author of Exodus know about these stories about other kings and things? Or is it that they know a specific story and they're borrowing it? Or are these ways that ancient people tended to tell stories in order to make points that people were familiar with? For the most part, I tend toward the latter, because my view is that the vast majority of ancient texts, let alone oral traditions, the vast, vast majority are lost. And it would be almost a miracle if it just turns out that the smoking gun has survived. In other words, that the one story that this person borrowed from happens to be the one that survived, when there probably were 100 others like this. It's possible. It is absolutely possible, but I don't think we know. And so I think that the Moses birth story is based on ancient Near Eastern parallels. The one we know about is Sargon, but there were probably others.
Is there good reason, in light of what you just said, to not date Moses after Sargon's story? Because a lot of people would look at this and think, Sargon, it seems Moses is carrying these narratives similar to it, but if we don't say they're genetic connected and they're somehow vaguely culturally connected, then we can't really date Moses later than Sargon. Technically, one apologist might make an argument to say, look, Sargon borrowed from Moses' story.
Yeah, well, that's true. You could say that. And it would be kind of unlikely because the story about one of the most historically important kings in the ancient Near East is more likely going to circulate broadly than a story about some obscure Israelite that nobody's, outside of Israel, Moses is not heard of. Sargon shows up in stories in other cultures. So it's unlikely that it went that way. But my view is that you can't date things on the basis of literary relationship unless you can actually show the precise literary connections. In the case of the Sargon story, there are connections that look pretty close. And so you could make the argument, people have, but it's the same thing with, for example, the Code of Hammurabi. When you get to the legal code, the law of Moses, there's sure a lot of laws that look like the law of Hammurabi. And in that case, you're pretty sure it didn't go the other direction. I mean, the law of Hammurabi is 18th century, right? It's like, but I don't think that you have to, again, say that this part of the Pentateuch, for example, the P source that has a lot of the legal material, necessarily knew the Code of Hammurabi, or the author of the Covenant Code in Exodus knew the Code of Hammurabi. May have, but I don't think that you've got, when you're dealing with these kinds of ancient sources, I don't think you should be too quick to leap on and say this is the smoking gun, because I just don't think we know that much.
Well put. In fact, I do a lot of research on people who are trying to see if there's Greek connections that far back. And I found an interesting one I want to throw at you to see your thoughts. It's during the wilderness experience. And I find it ironic that Odysseus is on a wilderness experience as well with his men. And they slaughter the calf that is to the sun god. And Odysseus goes off to pray, of course, on a mountain. His men slaughter this calf that is like for the sun god. And this god ends up killing all the men for eating the calf that was actually for the gods. And we find something kind of like a trope with Moses going up on the mountain, comes down, they make a golden calf, and the people who are active in that end up dying, other than Aaron, I believe. But he throws down the 10 Commandments, of course, the earth swallows them up. Do you think there's just a common trope floating around in the ancient Near East for Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey to come up with this kind of narrative? And we find something similar to the biblical one? Or are you not convinced on that particular comparison?
I think it's complicated. I had when I came to Chapel Hill to teach, my Hebrew Bible colleague was a very fine scholar named John Van Seters. And he found a lot of parallels between Greek traditions and Hebrew tradition, Israelite traditions in the Pentateuch. And it made him think that probably the Pentateuch was written much later than people had been saying. And so he thought most of it was written after the exile because of these Greek parallels. I think you have to be very careful when you look at these parallels because, again, I don't think they necessarily mean that there's direct borrowing. In the case of the Odyssey, there's a reference to it on the first page of the Odyssey, as it turns out. It's not that they just eat this one calf. They eat the cattle of Helios, the sun god, and they're warned, don't do that. Don't eat the cattle. And they're starving to death. And they end up on this island, and they're starving, so they eat the cattle, and they all get destroyed. But they're actually eating a number of cows, and they're destroyed almost immediately. And what's going on in the Exodus is, and they're on a sailing journey, obviously. What's going on in Exodus is you have people on a land journey, and they don't eat a cow. They make a cow, and they worship it. And the violation there isn't that they're not allowed to eat this person's favorite cattle, is that you're not supposed to make an image to God. And they don't die right away. They die 40 years. And so I don't think that the parallels are such to suggest that necessarily there's a borrowing going on. But I think I agree with you. You've got to look at all of these kinds of things and you say, wow, that has some really interesting similarities. And what you want to do, I think, is you want to pile them up. Like you don't want like an isolated one here and an isolated one. What you want to do is figure out, is there some way to kind of pile these things up? Like I don't believe in this thing with a lot of scholars have gotten all over the Odyssey about how this is this is be used by biblical authors, and I tend not to agree with them. But if I did want to do that kind of thing, I would point out, Odysseus and his people are trying to get to their home, and where are the children of Israel trying to get? They're trying to get to the land that's been promised. So there are things you could do, but you have to look very carefully and see if the parallels are close or if they're very broad. Well put,
Dr. Ehrman. I'm looking forward to this course. This is going to be a really, really good course on Moses. And I want to ask in this final question, do you think that the Moses narrative was really written down around the 8th century or so BC. When would you say, pen to paper, that I'm going to call it a foundation myth for Israel, the people of Israel. And I don't know whether to just say that as the Northern Kingdom, because obviously Judah kind of includes themselves into the tribal list after time, making them the special son, after talking to Andrew Tobolowsky on the myth of the 12 tribes of Israel and stuff like that. But my question is like, when do you think Moses, this story of Moses, was pen to paper, the myth was invented?
Well, the myth would have been invented before pen was put to paper. And I think it was in oral circulation for centuries before our accounts were written down. There are big debates, especially among these people you named earlier, these earlier scholars that you're mentioning, big debates about when the oldest sources of the Pentateuch were produced. The traditional dating that used to be standard, and really became standard at the end of the 19th century and was still standard basically in the 70s when I was starting to study this stuff, was that the oldest source is the J source, the Yahweh source that was written around the year 1000. And that the Elohist source, the E source, was written about 900 or in about the 9th century. So more like around 950 and 850, and most of the legal section in the Pentateuch, so parts of Exodus and then Leviticus and parts of Numbers, that section is attributed to the P source. But the P source isn't just laws; it's earlier stuff too, including Genesis 1 and 2. So J and E do provide the framework for much of the Exodus story about Moses. And in that dating, they would have been written around 950 to 850, but wouldn't have been put together into what we think of as the Pentateuch for several hundred years after that, probably after the exile. So the exile was in the 6th and then into the 5th century. So at the end of the 6th century. So I don't know the answer to that, but I wouldn't be surprised if you have written versions of this kind of thing at around, say, 900 BCE. Moses himself, by most datings today, if he did exist, the story seems to assume that it's taking place in the 13th century BCE. And so the first account would be about 400 years later, to put the simplest putting on it, in my view. Maybe about 400 years later, but a lot of scholars now are saying actually it was much later than that these things weren't written down till the 6th century. So, that would be 700 years after the events that we first get the written account.
And technically, there goes your historically reliable criteria, because memory is not to be trusted so well. You've written a book on that, so I hope people at least will take it with a grain of salt.
Well, I think that's the key. I think you take it with a grain of salt. I don't think you immediately discount it. You don't say it can't be right because it's so many years later, but you say historians always approach their sources critically and somewhat skeptically. Because if you didn't approach sources skeptically, you would just read every newspaper and say, "Oh yeah, that's what happened." But you realize, wait, when you listen to Fox News and you listen to MSNBC and they're reporting the same thing, you can't just say, "Yeah, they're both right." You treat each one skeptically to try and figure out what really did happen, and that's what you do with these sources. What kinds of archaeological evidence do you have? What kind of external literary evidence do you have? What kind of plausibility do you have? And on the basis of that, you try to figure out what probably happened. And you can't just get rid of it all, but you do suspect it. And then you try and figure out, is it right or not?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ehrman. Everybody go sign up, mythvisionpodcast.com/Moses. Get it now while there's early bird special. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say in this course. I'm sure we're going to get into all sorts of fun stuff. Anything you want to tease us with on our way out?
Well, I just want to say that this course is dealing with such an important issue because we're dealing with the foundations of the entire nation of Israel and the Jewish religion. The Exodus is where the Jewish people come to think of themselves as the chosen people. It's the Exodus that does that. They're following the law following the law is what makes a Jew Jewish, or at least the customs, and you get that in these books. And Christians, of course, I mean, Christianity emerges out of this as well. So in terms of a fundamental basis for both Judaism and Christianity, this is it. And so I think it's very important to look at this material historically, to see what we can say happened and what appears to be legendary, but also to see what's trying to be taught in these books. What is it that's important, and what are these laws all about? Are these Jews, are they a bunch of legalists? Why do they got all these laws? And like, how do you explain all of that? That's the kind of thing we're going to be doing in my course.
Thank you so much.